I want to start the series by saying that I want to approach the existence of the soul from a scientific point of view. And the very first thing when you do science is just to start by stating how that works. And the only prerequisite probably that we can have here is that any claim must be falsifiable. And that's just a fancy word for you can prove it's wrong. Alright, but mostly wrong. A good example of these are prime numbers. If I give you like a very, very high 10-digit number, you can do you can argue a lot about whether or not it's a prime number. You cannot really prove it's a prime number. That's not a falsifiable thingy. But you can prove it's not a prime number by showing me which factors, once you multiply them, create this number. So science works a lot like that. Sometimes you cannot prove something is something is right, like a number is prime, but you can prove the opposite. And we're gonna remember that concept, which is, I think, the most important one. Once we're done with prime numbers, I think the follow-up from that is that we're gonna talk about the brain and the mind. The mind, or mental states in general, can be understood as anything that has to do with what the self perceives. Could be things you see, things you listen to, can be your emotions, can be memories, even things you imagine. Those are all mental states to one extent or the other. And I'm just gonna use broadly mental states to refer to all those things. And then there is the brain, basically. So we're gonna discuss about both monism, which is the idea that all of the mental states come from the brain, stem from the brain, like the brain is the cause, and dualism, which says maybe mental states can be produced without the brain, in absence of a brain. That's dualism. And a lot of people think that it's a no-brainer that the mind comes from the brain, because there's so much science behind that. But there's a catch. And the catch is, if you think of the brain as a generator, that makes sense. But if you think of the brain as a filter, then all the biological studies we have done with the brain can be understood just like, as the action of a filter on this broader consciousness. Which is why you cannot prove monism. You cannot disprove dualism. Will be like more accurate. Meaning, sure, if someone says, oh, there's this invisible force, which is the soul, you cannot detect it, it's not made out of atoms or energy or anything that exists. And this undetectable thing works through the brain, and we are in the physical world. We cannot say, oh, that's not true, because it might be. You cannot prove it's wrong. So, if you cannot prove that's wrong, that doesn't mean that it's right? But then you have the opposite idea, which is everything comes from the brain, and you kind of sort of prove that wrong. And what you will need is to have mental states, at least one mental state, which is verifiably true, and no brain involvement. And this sounds silly, because most people are not familiar with this, or if they are familiar, they think of that as nice stories, but not any scientist will pay attention to it, not anything like that. Not, well, that's not true. There are two phenomenologies that I think are the most naturally occurring and consistent things that challenge the brain as the cause of all mental states. One is dying. People sometimes die. They experience things and then they come back and tell that. And we have measured to an extent brain activity. But the other is even more interesting, and it's reincarnation. These are known as cases of reincarnation type, of the reincarnation type. The University of Virginia has a list of all the instances in which kids have recalled a past life, and we know that there are around 2,500 of these cases, and more or less 2 out of 3 get solved. By solved, I mean someone listened to the kid, they took notes. If they gave information about place names like, the city or like general area, type of house, they usually recall names of their former parents, whether they had siblings, must remember their cause of death, so the circumstances of death. Someone goes back and check, and then 2/3 of the cases they find something very accurate. Sometimes they take the kids with them, and the kids are able to recognize people directly, to take them to places where things are hidden that people didn't know they were hidden, or they said, hey, where is this? And it turns out it has been moved by the former family to somewhere else. There are not like some documentaries about it. They will appear. You can see like Surviving Death on Netflix. The last episode has one of these in the first season. They show the kids pictures out of 2 options, maybe. I don't recall very well. 2 or 4 options. The kid always chooses the right one. And if you add the statistics to that single test on Netflix, you can say it's like very unlikely that by chance a kid will have solved those. So you can say that for near-death experiences, maybe the brain did something. For these cases, it's a bit harder. I don't feel like going through all of these cases with you right now. I just can tell you there are 2 books where you can explore kind of like the phenomenology of these cases and decide by yourself. I used to think this was nonsense, basically because I deferred to experts on this, right? They were scientists. I was a young person when I heard any story like this, mostly about near-death experiences, but not really reincarnation. Besides the Dalai Lama, I thought, well, if the experts will think this is true, then they will have checked that. As time passed, I did some courses on science myself. I published papers myself. Then I stopped deferring to others and checked the studies myself, or the case reports myself. And I will say that I have the means to do so right now. And if I read the evidence, I think there's no good reason to dismiss all of this phenomenology. We can say it's like very compelling, and we should keep an open mind. The first book is Life Before Life by Jim Tucker, mainly about reincarnation. And the other one is The Self Does Not Die by Titus Rivas and some other people. The first one, I fully endorse it. The second one, I would recommend you go through the cases, just looking at the phenomenological description, because sometimes the authors go beyond in their interpretation, and I do not endorse their interpretation all of the time. But the cases are there, and the good thing is that they personally contacted people involved to verify the accuracy of the cases, as happened with the cases in Life Before Life. I started this series by saying that this is like a true scientific endeavor, and that if we want to move forward, we have to work with falsifiable claims. That is, things we can prove wrong. the thing is, whenever I read skeptical accounts, sometimes they're honest, like the model for near-death experience based on neurological information we have now, which is out there, but it's arguably incomplete. But there's also things that are not truly falsifiable from the skeptic arena. For instance, there is this very old case of someone who reported leaving their body, going through the roof of the room and outside to the hospital. And they said, and I remember I saw this shoe, this red shoe on the door on the third floor on a place that is not really accessed by anyone. And they went and checked, and the floor was there. And the explanation, the rational explanation here was, the patient must have seen it somehow any given day before, or probably while he was on course through the ambulance. And that's how he knew. And we cannot prove that's wrong, but that doesn't mean it's right. So I started by saying that mind dualism is a non-falsifiable claim, but very often the people debunking the evidence that supports the model of the dual mind do the same. They just simply use non-falsifiable claims, but they don't look like that, but they are. In the first case for dualists, they say, well, there's an invisible connection between mind and brain, and the mind is something ethereal. But the debunkers instead say there's like an invisible connection between, the person who reported the evidence and the evidence itself. Like, he must have known somehow, although we don't know how. That's also non-falsifiable. And I invite people to, keep engaging with the evidence, but with this in mind. Rarely you will see there's true proof of that the evidence was somehow found through natural means. One of the most interesting aspects of this, to me, is that people who embrace science and truly look for the soul through scientific means then will recognize that if people who died could somehow perceive something veridical without their senses, that this is possible, right? It must be possible for humans under certain conditions to gather information from their environment. So they started designing experiments where they isolate people. There is acoustic shielding, visual shielding, electromagnetic shielding, so they cannot receive signals even if they have a device. And then they select a random target, and the people inside who claims to, that they can do this, they have to guess whatever the target is. And we don't see this as a purely scientific endeavor and simultaneously as the search for the soul. We call these people crazy. We label them as parapsychologists. And we actively try to ignore any of their findings and saying that that's not real science. And I don't like that. And I think that we should be talking openly about this, and we should be reviewing the literature about this phenomena. And I want to finish today's videos with a message from Carl Sagan. Carl Sagan wrote The Demon-Haunted World. And after writing everything about pseudoscience and skepticism, he said, well, all things aside, there are three phenomena that we should be taking a look at because they might be true, even though I don't believe it so right now, but they might be true, so we should be looking into it. He mentioned people altering by thought through random number generators, people perceiving in mild sensory deprivation images, like basically clairvoyance or telepathy, through Ganswell experiments, probably what he was referring to. And children who know no details about past lives that cannot be explained in any other way than reincarnation. So I think Carl Sagan was smart enough to know there's something worth looking at there.